Hello. So in this part of the lecture, we are going to look at a popular form of media for historical instruction that would have really not been possible without YouTube. And the two are the John Green's ubiquitous Crash Course in History. And then finally, not the TED Talk per se, but the TED animated videos. Not only are they both great resources for future instructors like yourself, in other words, to break up a monotony of a lecture or just kind of amuse them with graphics, but they also now get to kind of our theory of pedagogy or in teaching. What do these videos tell us about how history is conveyed in the 21st century? Keep that question in mind when we watch the following video. So let's start off with Ted Green, who kind of, if you want to say, is perhaps the most iconic person who took information and created it in historical information, put it in graphical format in videos no longer than 10 minutes. Which then also brings up the question, what would Marshall McLuhan say of such videos? So here we begin with John Green, and I apologize, there's something wrong with Zoom. It's sometimes when I'm playing a video on Zoom, it slows down. Let me make sure I have the sound on. So I do realize, yeah, that there are technical problems with it. But there's a reason why I'm not just giving you the links and say watch them on your own, because I want to break them down bit by bit and discuss them with you. Okay.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about a subject that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. Disease. This is a tough subject for me personally because I'm a bit of a hypochondriac, but to be fair, my fears are kind of rational. I am afraid that my existence will be ended by a soulless microscopic organism, and to be fair, they have killed a lot of people. You're not paranoid if germs are actually out to get you, and as we'll see today, they are. Fortunately, we live in the 21st century when communicable disease does not play such a massive role in human history, unless of course you count bird flu or SARS or HIV/AIDS or antibiotic-resistant bacteria. All right, Stan, let's just go to the intro. Okay, so longtime viewers of Crash Course will remember the 16th century Great Dying in the Americas, not only as an example of historical.
Now that image, if you want one iconic image of the Great Dying in the Americas, smallpox ravaging 90% of the population. It's this image from a codex from its time. Okay, one of the few primary sources, but also one of the images that serves as an immediate reference to understand the plagues that affected Central and South America after the Columbus exchange. Any textbook, you're going to see this image, and if any of you are going to give a lecture on the Americas after 1492, this is that one image you have to include.
Historians' total inability to name things, but also as perhaps the most important and wide-ranging effect that disease has had on human cultures in millennia. But traditionally, the study of history hasn't focused much on diseases, partly because they're mysterious and terrifying, and partly because they don't fit in very well with our ideas about history being the result of human agency.
Okay, so that's quite profound. So now he's what is he referring us to? The state of the literature. Yes, history of diseases has always been a niche subject. And writing kind of grand narratives of history with the role of diseases in the background has been just that. Diseases have usually been put in the background rather than seeing it the other way around, as the history of human society becoming a product or dependent on the way diseases have dictated and determined the fate of human civilizations. And here he gets to the point. Human agency, and though another way to think of human agency, think of the debate about the history of being great, the history of great men, for example. That's old school history, written because, of course, these are historians are trained to factor in human agency. Disease, like the climate, is kind of an invisible force always operating on history, and that's why it's been relegated.
We like to imagine that things happen because we did good things, or because we did bad things, or at least because we did some kind of thing. But in fact, history often happens because lots of people got smallpox. There's also the fact that diseases were often seen to be the result of divine will, or else divine wrath. Plus, because people didn't know that much.
If you're living abroad and are looking for a way of making money online, this free training will blow your mind.
Okay. History was
about disease, they didn't write about it very often, and when they did write about it, they didn't always write about it particularly well. So when you read primary sources, often they're like, why'd they die? Well, too much of that miasma. That's not particularly helpful to us. So given all that, we are going to have to engage in a bit of speculation here. Mr. Green, I love speculation. It's way more fun than history. Like, what would have happened if the South won the Civil War? No, me from the past. Not that kind of speculation. The kind of speculation where you guess what did happen, not what would have happened. So diseases have been with humans as long as there have been, like...
And what would have happened, of course, that's another realm of history, counterfactual history. What if the South had AK-47s during the Civil War? That was a serious counterfactual historical exercise.
Humans. And humans first appeared in tropical regions in Africa, which are home to a wide variety of microparasites, so it's probably a good bet that those parasites played a role in keeping human populations really low for a long, long time. It's only after we see migration out of Africa and into regions less amenable to diseases, about 64,000 years ago, that we start to see the growth of human populations necessary to create what we problematically call civilizations. So humans migrated into river valleys that became the cradles of civilization, with agriculture and surpluses, etc. This allowed us to escape those population-limiting tropical diseases, but it created all kinds of new disease problems. The communities in river valleys had more people and more population density, which allowed for epidemics. I mean, one of the great things about hunting and gathering is that diseases cannot wipe out a city if you don't have cities. Also, river valleys can be...
And in other words, without him saying it directly, when humans were divided into hunting and gathering communities, by definition, you could have epidemics because usually they were isolated if they were afflicted with a disease. The disease knocked out their tribe, and usually the disease died with them. Key point to keep in mind.
Breeding grounds for disease, especially where cultures developed irrigation, which often relied on slow-moving or standing water. And if you've ever had to clean a bird bath, you'll know that standing water is the perfect environment for disease carriers and nasty microorganisms. For example, schistosomiasis was recorded in Egypt as early as 1200 BCE. What is that, Stan? Oh, apparently it's a parasitic flatworm. Do we still have that? Yeah, we do. We do. Awesome. Anyway, lots of diseases come from domesticated animals. But you can't have bacon without swine flu. So, it's come see, come saw. That's going to be a hilarious joke when we all die of swine flu. Just kidding. We're all going to die of bird flu. But from like a macro-historical perspective, it's not like disease is all downside. I mean, sometimes it's helped populations shield themselves from conquest. That was the case in Africa until the 19th century. Okay, so we like to say that one of the hallmarks of civilization is writing, and pandemic diseases were the type of events that people tended to write about in early civilizations because they were a big deal. Like pestilence appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Early Chinese historians describe the increase in disease as populations spread from the northern Yellow River region to the more tropical Yangtze River region. Ancient Greece was relatively disease-free because of its climate and also the isolated nature of city-states, but the more the cities became involved in trade, the more susceptible to epidemics they were. The best example of this was the plague that struck Athens in 430 and 429 BCE during the Peloponnesian War. And that leads us to a very important point, which is there is a decent correlation between war and disease. Armies tended to carry it along with them, and food shortages and displacements made civilians more likely to get sick. That is still very much the case, and the weird symbiotic relationship between war and disease is something that we're going to look a lot at in the next several weeks. But nothing spreads disease quite like trade. Trade is so...
So, again, the relationship between war and disease, and Chase, I know you're doing a paper on that subject, but think of all the histories you've read of World War I, military histories focusing on the tactics, so on and so forth. Rarely is there a military history of World War I that looked at how the Spanish flu dictated the outcome towards the end of 1918.
Good for economies and so bad at keeping individual human beings not dead. Like ancient Rome's integration into transcontinental trade networks like the Silk Road may explain why the historian Livy recorded at least 11 pestilential disasters, and it is very likely that disease and the accompanying decline in population contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. But of course, you can't talk about the history of disease without mentioning the most famous epidemic of all time, the Black Death. I mean, if the Black Death were a soccer team, it would be Liverpool Football Club. If the Black Death were a band, it would be the Beatles. If the Black Death were an industry, it would be 18th century textile processing in Liverpool. The plague, which struck Europe in the mid-14th...
And this is also now another question we have to ask, because this is the second time we've seen videos where the first was the Wisecrack video, now this video. Why is it the Black Death is the celebrity, the Beatles of all pandemics? Something we have to ask ourselves. The question isn't obvious, and that in and of itself is its own research question. What is it about the Black Death that holds such a grip on our popular imagination? That's why I showed this video for this lecture. This is what we're going to be interrogating when we meet on Wednesday.
Century originated in fleas that came from rats, and bubonic plague can be found throughout the world, even in the western US today. It's more treatable now, thankfully. But anyway, the Black Death started in China and spread westward over the caravan routes, really picking up steam when...
Now, you see, Crash Course in History is quite good. I mean, I really like the work John Green does. Even his videos on Middle East history are really spot on. But, sometimes he'll say something that the historical literature hasn't agreed on. And sometimes this distinction is important. Did the Black Death begin in China? Archaeological evidence suggests it began in Inner Central Asia. Now, Inner Central Asia borders China. But why is this distinction important? It's important because if we don't make this distinction, what kind of impression are we left with? That China is just a giant petri dish of germs. What doesn't begin in China? I mean, it's an impression we could get. And of course, first we have to answer that China contains a quarter of the world's population. Of course, diseases are going to spread from there. But then we also have to be historically accurate. In this case, it wasn't crowded, dense inhabitation that led to the emergence of the plague, but the marmot or giant gerbil population that is more indigenous to the steppes of Central Asia. So we're talking about Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia.
Plague-carrying rats jumped onto Mediterranean trading ships. So the death rate from this plague was incredibly high. Perhaps a third of people living in Europe died. Oh, it must be time for the open letter. Oh, look, it's the Grim Reaper. Stay away from me. An open letter to the Black Death. Dear Black Death, I don't want to compliment you, but that term, Black Death, is just some fantastic branding. Such a scary term. It's a shame that people in the actual 14th century didn't use it. It was first coined in 1832 by a German doctor and professor of the history of medicine, J.F.K. Hecker. And the term became popular in English after it was used in A History of England by Elizabeth Cartwright Penrose. So great job, J.F.K. Hecker. It took a historian who was also a doctor to come up with a name as catchy as the Black Death, but for once, historians, you did it. A terrifying thing got the terrifying name it deserved. Best wishes, John Green. So we're not 100% sure that the Black Death was bubonic plague. Its virulence suggests that in some places it might have been pneumonic, but we have descriptions of it that match bubonic plague, like this one from Florentine chronicler Matteo Villani. It was a plague that touched people of every condition, age, and sex. They began to spit blood, and then they died, some immediately, some in 2 or 3 days, and some in a longer time. Most had swellings in the groin, and many had them in the left and right armpits and in other places. One could almost always find an unusual swelling somewhere on the victim's body. Stan, I appreciate you doing that in text and not pictures because it sounds truly horrible. Thank goodness that was the last we saw of outbreaks of bubonic plague. What's that? There was an outbreak in 1904 in San Francisco? Oh boy. And India in 1994? Obviously the plague affected a lot of individuals.
Now, of course, that description of the bubonic plague that's where the word bubonic comes from, those outgrowths that were otherwise in black in color and known as buboes. And then once those Swellings, that swelling would then further release the bacteria and infect the next patient. Kind of like the alien that comes out of your stomach and then goes on to infect other people. A very similar dynamic.
Lives, but it also affected world history. Like plague probably contributed to the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China in the 14th century, but its greatest effects were felt in Western Europe. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. There's some debate about whether the Black Death kickstarted Europe's economy and ended the...
And I hate to say this, but this is my favorite part of these crash courses, are these thought bubbles, these kind of graphics. Because I find them adorable, but... I mean, okay, this is pretty sordid. It's pretty morbid. But anyway, you have to have a thought bubble for history. That's the medium of the message of Crash Course History.
Middle Ages. It probably did create some opportunity, like guilds were forced to admit new members to replace the many workers who had died, and persistent European inflation until the end of the 14th century suggests both a shortage of products and higher wages. Again, Matteo Villani provides us with some evidence of the effect of the plague on Italy's economy. Nurses and minor artisans working with their hands want 3 times or nearly the usual pay, and laborers on the land all want oxen and all seed and want to work the best lands and to abandon all others. So the plague may have actually been good for workers, at least those who survived. The plague also probably changed European Christianity. When faced with seemingly random and widespread death, some people abandoned piety for hedonism, and ineffectiveness of priests in dealing with the crisis may have led to an increase in anti-clericalism and a greater receptiveness to the ideas of the Protestant Reformation. And attempts to combat the plague changed the way that Europeans lived, too. For example, there were new construction techniques, such as building out of brick instead of wood. And in many places, tile roofing replaced thatched roofs where rats like to live. These new shelters created more barriers between humans and disease-carrying rodents, and plus there were fewer plague-infested rats falling out of the sea. So that's nice. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the Black Death looms larger in our Eurocentric imaginations, but in terms of devastation and human suffering, it pales in comparison to the great dying that accompanied the Columbian Exchange. The pre-Columbian Americas were certainly no paradise, but the records we have suggest that Amerindian cultures were largely free of disease until the arrival of Europeans. They did have syphilis, but that's preventable. Not to be redundant, but the most obvious and often most overlooked aspect of the Great Dying is the dying. I mean, perhaps 90% of native populations of the Americas may have perished, destroying communities and families and entire cultures. And at the same time that diseases were destroying indigenous social orders, Europe's population was growing, thus creating more pressure to colonize the Americas, Asia, Africa, and eventually Australia. And so it's fair to say, as historian Jared Diamond has, that disease was, if not the decisive factor, a crucial determinant of Europe's dominance in the modern era. So while not exactly the last hurrah of epidemics, the world has not seen anything remotely like the devastation brought by the Columbian Exchange since. Some of that is due to our new shared immunological profiles, but much of it can be chalked up to massive improvements in science and medicine. The most significant medical advance in the battle against viral epidemic diseases like smallpox was inoculation, which was probably actually invented in Asia, but came into wide use in England after 1721 and in continental Europe about a century later. And then the development of antibiotics in the 20th century proved extremely effective against bacterial diseases like bubonic plague and tuberculosis. Some of these advances have had tremendous results, like smallpox has been eliminated from the human population. But infectious disease continues to be a leading killer of humans, and we still see deadly epidemics of diseases like...
Sorry, I just want to go back to that.
Extremely effective against bacterial diseases like bubonic plague and tuberculosis. Some of these advances have had...
Sometimes we don't realize what a vaccine looks like. Dried calf lymph type. In other words, this is, look at the word calf and the word vaccine. And now you see the connection. Vaccine comes from the Latin, and if you know Spanish, vaca, okay? Or in Latin with 2 C's, vaca, okay? And that's where we get the word vaccine from. To defeat smallpox, we get material that comes from calves. You think there that looks like a needle is technically called a lancet. And that is one of the most famous medical journals of the United Kingdom. It's known as the Lancet.
tremendous results, like smallpox has been eliminated from the human population. But infectious disease continues to be a leading killer of humans, and we still see deadly epidemics of diseases like cholera around the world. And even though antibiotics have been in wide use for less than 100 years, many drug-resistant bacteria have already emerged, and terrifying diseases like tuberculosis have started to make a bit of a comeback. Then you have modern endemic diseases like HIV/AIDS, along with the lurking threat of new and terrifying epidemics like the various flus we often hear about. All of that reminds us that disease is still shaping human history and has the potential to be the most powerful force in human history.
My argument.
Like the one that ends it. We like to think that the human story is both told by and made by humans, but in fact it's a lot more complicated than that because we share this planet with countless creatures. I know we all like to think of ourselves as individuals, but we cannot separate ourselves not only from other people, but also from the larger biosphere. That whole story is the story of history. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is filmed in the Chad and Stacy Emigholt studio.
Okay, so that's our crash course in history. 2.9 million views. If you want to talk about popular historical memory, you don't really get in terms of that kind of 10-minute crash course introduction to history as popular as John Green's series. Nonetheless, let's compare its other competitor, which usually comes in at under 5 minutes. So what are we seeing here? Is history being packaged into short video bits, the TED animated series. And let's compare that to the crash course coming in at a little under 1 million views.
Why do so many people keep pretending that a job gives them security? Why are they answering that they're...
Imagine if half the people in your neighborhood, your city, or even your whole country were wiped out. It might sound like something out of an apocalyptic horror film, but it actually happened in the 14th century during a disease outbreak known as the Black Death. Spreading from China through Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, the devastating epidemic...
Again, look again, spreading from China. Now, I have to again emphasize. Okay. Most evidence points to Inner Central Asia, an area where even historically China had no influence of.
It destroyed as much as 1/5 of the world's population, killing nearly 50% of Europeans in just 4 years. One of the most fascinating and puzzling things about the Black Death is that the illness itself was not a new phenomenon, but one that has affected humans for centuries. DNA analysis of bone and tooth samples from this period, as well as an earlier epidemic known as the Plague of Justinian in 541 CE, has revealed that both were caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that causes bubonic plague today. What this means is that the same disease caused by the same pathogen can behave and spread very differently throughout history. Even before the use of antibiotics, the deadliest outbreaks in modern times, such as the ones that occurred in early 20th century India, killed no more than 3% of the population. Modern instances of plague also tend to remain localized or travel slowly, as they are spread by rodent fleas. But
what a great image. That's all I have to say. So in other words, I had some cute cartoons like John Green. So of course, this is why I personally love these videos. And
the medieval Black Death, which spread like wildfire, was most likely communicated directly from one person to another. And because genetic comparisons of ancient and modern strains of Yersinia pestis have not revealed any significantly functional genetic differences, the key to why the earlier outbreak was so much deadlier must lie not in the parasite, but the host. For about 300 years during the High Middle Ages, a warmer climate and agricultural improvements had led to explosive population growth throughout Europe. But with so many new mouths to feed, the end of this warm period spelled disaster. High fertility rates combined with reduced harvests meant the land could no longer support its population.
Now, what did both videos ignore in both cases? So the TED Talk deals with the agricultural output. But what is it failing to deal with is the other role of climate change in dictating reduced crop outputs.
while the abundant supply of labor kept wages low. As a result, most Europeans in the early 14th century experienced a steady decline in living standards, marked by famine, poverty, and poor health, leaving them vulnerable to infection. And indeed, the skeletal remains of Black Death victims found in London show telltale signs of malnutrition and prior illness. The destruction caused by the Black Death changed humanity in two important ways. On a societal level, the rapid loss of population led to important changes in Europe's economic conditions. With more food to go around, as well as more land and better pay for the surviving farmers and workers, people began to eat better and live longer, as studies of London cemeteries have shown. Higher living standards also brought an increase in social mobility, weakening feudalism, and eventually leading to political reforms.
Which is all true, but there's also something that, for 5 minutes, or in this case, 4 minutes and 12 seconds of history, you're always going to have to omit something. How did those people survive? And all it has to do with is a rare genetic mutation that made very small part of the population more liable to survive, okay? And of course, once they survive, then what happens? The survivors, of course, then repopulate Europe, where you have now a repopulated Europe with this genetic mutation that makes them much stronger to resist bubonic plague.
But the plague also had an important biological impact. The sudden death of so many of the most frail and vulnerable people left behind a population with a significantly different gene pool, including genes that may have helped survivors resist the disease. And because such mutations often confer immunities to multiple pathogens that work in...
So sorry, in other words, I was meant to say that about John Green's video. This one covers it. Of course, John Green didn't look at even though he had a good 10 minutes. Well, then let's give him credit. He was looking at all pandemics.
Similar ways. Research to discover the genetic consequences of the Black Death has the potential to be hugely beneficial. Today, the threat of an epidemic on the scale of the Black Death has been largely eliminated thanks to antibiotics. But the bubonic plague continues to kill a few thousand people worldwide every year. And the recent emergence of a drug-resistant strain threatens the return of darker times. Learning more about the causes and effects of the Black Death is important, not just for understanding how our world has been shaped by the past. It may also help save us from a similar nightmare in the future.
Okay. So in terms of our short media, there we go. Now we went from Crash Course History, a little bit over 10 minutes, the TED Talk, the TED animation series, a little bit under 5 minutes. But if you want in my opinion, what was the best media dealing with the origins and effects of the Black Plague? It's the following at a little bit under 3 minutes. Watch and enjoy.
It's the plague, gonna kill you in a few days. A pandemic so severe, Black Death caused such horror and fear. And there ain't no cure for that, girl. You'll be dead in no time flat, girl. You get acronecrosis from the Yersinia pestis, and it makes your tongue a black, girl. Gonna bury you out and back, girl. Ooh, fleas on rats, fleas on rats. Ooh, fleas on rats. In China, don't know how, but the Mongols used biological warfare. At Kaffa, hurl plague corpses at the Genoese. The Italians fled back to Sicily, and in 1347, Black Death set a load to Europe in the form of infected fleas. From port cities along trade roads, buboes swelling in the nose, and it spread real fast like that, girl. Better flee when you see a rat, girl. People living for the now, bro, like the book by Boccaccio. Or you could be a flagellant, girl. Flog yourself till you repent, girl. Kilometers a day, and in 5 years killed 2/3 of the population. Some blame the lepers or Jews. the poison of wells. It led to peasant revolts, loss of faith, and some serious persecution. People carried pouches of herbs to protect them from the smell. Doctors didn't know what caused it. Bolt your door if your family's afflicted. Bodies in the carts, girl. Skeletons in the art, girl. With the decreased population led to the amelioration of the peasant folk. Hey, they could ask for more pay. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats. Let me hear you say, this plague is bubonic. B-U-B-O-N-I-C. 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 A pandemic so severe, the Black Death caused such horror and fear, and there ain't no cure for that, girl. You'll be dead in no time flat, girl. You get necrosis from the Yersinia pestis, and it makes your tongue a black girl. Gonna bury you out back, girl. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats. Ooh, freeze on rats, freeze on rats.
Okay, yes. Not only a good medium to teach about the Black Death, but then also, why did I show this? Are there any other music videos about any other pandemics? And that's the question I leave you with before we come together tomorrow. Thank you.